Well, it's this, and you know what? It's so to me, it's almost like I daren't say. I just want to like hold up, I want to hold up the essays in the supplement, by Aaron Alston and the essays by Michael Stackpole. My hands trembling and go, you sniffing. Read, just read it. Yeah.
Well, I think Aaron Alston was probably decades ahead of
Oh,
anyone when it comes to talking about character creation and putting the thought into how you create your character. A few months back, when they re-released the original Strike Force on PDF, I did a review of it at InWorld, and I mean, it's just even today you look at that and you just go, wow. I mean, he had stuff that just some designers are just now catching up to that he was talking about in like 1980.
and it hit me
And
really hard when I was playing, and that stuff influenced us tremendously. And a great deal of what I talk about later in terms of the story is yours to make or break as you go along, all that kind of writing that I've done is I quote Alston, Peterson, and Stackpole on Champions all the time.
well, one of the points that I made in my review was that I compared Strike Force to the first Velvet Underground album,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and said that it didn't sell a lot of copies, but the copies it sold all went into the hands of people who ended up becoming designers.
Yeah, well, you can. I'll now name another one, Steve Long.
And I don't think it's unique to Champions, but I think a lot of the early era role-playing games, whether it's Champions or D&D or Call of Cthulhu, they all had that focus on emergent play, where your character
Yeah.
came out during play, the setting developed during play. Everything that we had as the tools back then were very bare bones to start with.
Bare bones
So
are
that
so
meant,
quirky in many cases.
yeah,
Yeah,
well, yeah,
yeah.
but because of that, it made for a particular style of play that I think is unique to the early generations of role playing across the board. What do you think? How do you think that worked within Champions? That sort of style of emergent play.
Well, in many ways, and I'm allowing for individual variations. Fantasy by 1980 was sort of becoming there was sort of a circularity with D&D that was starting to come into existence at that point. If you look at the fantasy games up through about 1980, you'll find that they are highly individualized. Things like Dragon Quest, things like Melanda, things like high fantasy.
Arduin.
Arduin, absolutely. They're highly, highly individualized and incredibly vivid. Petal Throne, etc. Early
Right.
RuneQuest, Tunnels and Trolls. And then by after about 1980, new fantasy role playing games kind of knew that the game in town of fantasy looked like this. And they started to be very accommodating toward a specific kind of fantasy that D&D didn't even start as, but kind of had by the Bloom era of the early 80s was really, and the RPGA was really starting to look like one thing. And so other fantasy games started to kind of imitate that. A lot of us didn't like that. A lot of us felt D&D had, basically been sucked dry and had never really been quite as powerful as something like RuneQuest anyway. And and so a lot of us burned out on fantasy role playing at exactly that point for a number of reasons, but that was the big one for a lot of us. It just wasn't going to be able to produce the kinds of things that we thought of as fantasy or that fantasy should be able to do if you were doing it. And so therefore, it was really getting hard to kind of identify with it. Whereas comics, comics at that era, we are talking, you know, 1974, and that's earlier than most people think, is when that giant size X-Men appeared with all the characters. It lay fallow after that special issue for 2 years, 3 years. 1977 is when Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum rebooted the series with issue 97. And then by 1980, we were well into the Byrne era. And so that's what the X-Men were doing, and the Comic Dome was almost completely bowled over by that and related titles of different sorts. Now, they'd also been trained on some of the freakiest shit in comics, mainstream comics ever, the whole Warlock saga and everything.
Yeah.
And the Legion had gotten rebooted into a more science fiction-y way. Um, so there was a lot of emphasis on character development in the comics, where the characters were going. And again, the fact that you had no idea. There were no miniseries, maxi series. A crossover meant like 4 issues, that long.
Yeah.
And so the idea, of these larger scale, editorially planned, choreographed interactions among the titles for a huge maxi saga, no, the equivalents were these incredibly scattershot, improvisational, usually like desperately Hail Mary save kind of, things across
Well,
titles. So we were used to stories where you didn't know where it was going, and you actually kind of knew that the creators, they were finding out one step ahead of you in some cases, sometimes not, but often. And so, at least in the long term for the characters. And so I think we were like on comics that were no longer the 1960s franchise characters, especially from DC, which were fixed with their TV shows. But they were now characters that could, in the comics, change and go anywhere and die, and you really weren't sure which way it was going. And it was all about like who was sleeping with who and all that kind of stuff
yeah.
too, and whose
Well,
villain was whose dad, and we were all into that. So that's what we were
I think
coming in from the comics. And role playing can do this. We know what to do. Does that make any sense?
Oh no,
We
it makes
know
perfect.
what to do.
It's funny because I think a lot of those changes that you're talking about came about also as Stan Lee kind of stepped down from the active control of things at Marvel too.
Yeah,
When he started letting go of characters, because his big thing was always the illusion of change.
right.
It looks like things change, but things don't really change.
You're right. When Thomas became editor in chief, and all those young writers, and Thomas could pick writers. He picked Englehart, he picked Conway, he picked Gerber, he picked McGregor,
Yeah.
he picked, Steranko had gotten in already under Lee, but Thomas picked Starlin, right?
Yep.
All this was happening. And then there were then the editorial turnovers went bonkers. You can't say the lunatics were running the asylum. You were saying basically the asylum was, just
running the lunatics.
Yeah, exactly. The asylum was running the lunatics. Many comics fans look at that era as this embarrassing era of disorganized craziness, but really all the content everybody loves at Marvel came out of that. And the same thing goes for DC. Infantino was editor at DC, and Artist was the editor in chief at DC for a few years, and that's when all that great shit went down at DC with Speedy becoming a heroin addict and all that stuff, all the crazy stuff. Batman, the whole redefinition of Batman as the kind of the weird conjunction of not being able to use a gun and being semi-murderous.
Beating the crap out of people.
Yeah, well, exactly. That was a weird thing because the original Batman was this kind of off the wall kind of guy too, but he packed a gun. Because back in the 30s and 40s, until DC changed their code, it was fine. And so this was the first time you had Batman like in this weird contradiction, and Batman has been in that contradiction as a dramatic thing ever since. Yeah. So it was just during this period that all this thing happened. This depth, but also this improvisational irresponsibility. Just we're writing the next issue, and it might be a classic or it might be a stinker. Let's find out. And those are the comics that we were taught by when we came in. That different worlds. You look at the X-Men and you see this is about champions, and you were like, click.
Well, and that fits into what I was just saying, talking about emergent play, where these writers didn't really know what they were going to be doing. the next issue. But yeah, I mean, but yeah, I think that role playing games like Champions are really able to kind of ride that wave because it, like what you talk about in the playtest document, about the importance of the disadvantages and the psychological disadvantages and the thing. I mean, that is the stuff that rose up in comics because of that era.
Yeah, and also I think a lot of us understood, and I'm thinking of the people that I played with and then people I met who were playing, independently of me. And we may have had different play styles in a lot of ways, but I think a lot of us understood that the term disadvantage was a misnomer from the start. And Steve understands that too. That's why he calls them complications in six. But they weren't things that you like, were upset that you had to have. They weren't like, okay, well, my character, is harder to play or is shittier because of this so that I can have that other good thing. It wasn't a balance of bad and good. This was like, give me the disadvantages. I am going to give the GM a plate of disadvantages that is just going to bowl them over and, woe betide the GM if they don't make these disadvantages pop because they can't help it. And so, the notion of the disadvantages as actually the strongest, one of the most strongest, most wonderful features of your character, but also the change, the change, the change. It is so interesting. You get these experience points. They seem so piddly. It's like, God, it takes 250 points to build this character. I only get 2 or 3. Experience goes so slowly. 10 sessions later, you're looking at a substantial, not just improve a little bit, not just like beef that up a little bit. Most of the other games, it's pretty easy to beef things up, but real easy to real hard to redefine things. Champions? No. These points you've accumulated. Never mind your perfectly crafted starting character. You thought of your character as perfectly balanced, perfectly constructed. No, these are pouring on you. These are pouring on you. Do something. Change. You played this game almost to surf the onrushing wave of how much your character was numerically changing. Is real evident. It's one of those emergent things. You will not see that just by reading the rules. It'll look just like ordinary improvement to you. Yeah, so a couple character points every session. Every game does that. Tons of games do that. But if you look at how hard it is for the character to change, a GURP Supers character, a character from the early White Wolf games, any number, I can name a dozen games that are built on the same notion that you build a character with points, and then you get a couple more of the same points every session. I mean, this is a standard model.
Oh, yeah.
But Champions is the only one where your character is just going to be someone else in not 10 years, not 10 stories of multiple sessions, 10 sessions. I mean, the system. I mean, if you've got 250 points and you're looking at 30 points,
that's a significant part of your character.
Yeah, you've got room, and if you use those as essays and the rules and stuff and the supplements, looking at their suggestions, and you realize and look at Strikeforce, they thought of that change as their big payoff. That was where, because you were only going to change based on what happened in play. They say over and over in the rules and supplements, don't start big. Don't make 300-point characters. Don't make 400-point characters. Make them low. Same recommendation I give in Champions now, 200 to 250. Keep them low. Because your 300-point character built up from experience is way better, is way more of what you're looking for in this game than a 300-point character built out of the gate. There is no comparison. So to me, that embrace of the dynamism of character, and you don't know what the changes are going to be because they're always going to be affected by the events of the sessions, the actual content. I mean, it really is to me a skill or a possibility for play, an option for play that today in role playing is still regarded as exotic.
Yeah.
And here I am saying, no, excuse me, this is one of the games. If you ask anybody, the 5 most influential titles in role playing, Champions is one of them. It has to be. And
Yeah.
there it is. Everything I just said is they're not even hiding it. It's absolutely explicit. This is what those authors were about.